Desert Rose. The dust kicked up by the departing stagecoach settled like a shroud over Sage Hollow, Arizona territory, leaving Eleanor Hartwell standing alone in the suffocating heat of late afternoon. Her traveling dress, once a respectable shade of burgundy, now bore the stains of 3 days' hard travel across desert wasteland. In one gloved hand, she clutched a worn carpet bag. In the other, a crumpled letter bearing the signature of one Jacob Morrison, a man who had promised her marriage, security, and a fresh start far from the ghosts of her past. The town spread before her like scattered bones in the desert, weathered buildings squatting low against the horizon. A few curious faces peered from doorways and windows, but no welcoming committee awaited. No husband-to-be emerged from the shadows to claim his mail-order bride. Eleanor's eyes swept the dusty main street until they settled on what should have been her destination. Where the letter had promised a modest ranch house, she found only charred timbers and a stone chimney standing like a tombstone against the red sky. The acrid smell of old fire still lingered in the dry air. "You looking for Jacob Morrison's place?" Eleanor turned to find a woman in faded calico, her face weathered by sun and hardship. The woman's eyes held neither kindness nor cruelty, just the careful neutrality of someone who had learned not to expect much from strangers. "Yes," Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. I was to be his wife." The woman's expression shifted, softening just slightly. "I'm Mary Hutchins, run the boarding house." She gestured toward the ruins. "Fire took the place 2 months back, lightning strike during the summer storms. Jacob." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Well, nobody's seen him since. Could be he got out and just kept riding. Could be he didn't." Eleanor stared at the blackened remains, her grip tightening on the carpet bag. Inside it, wrapped in her mother's silk scarf, lay the remnants of a fortune that no longer existed on any legal document. The Hartwell Mining Company had been her grandfather's legacy, her father's empire, and her birthright, until she'd walked away from it all rather than marry the man the board of directors had chosen for her. "What will you do now, miss?" Mary asked, not unkindly. Eleanor lifted her chin, a gesture that had once commanded boardrooms and now faced down an uncertain future. "I'm staying." Mary's eyebrows rose. "Staying? There's nothing here for you now." "There's land," Eleanor said, studying the plot where Morrison's house had stood. "And land can be rebuilt." That first night, Eleanor slept in the boarding house's smallest room, listening to the coyotes sing in the distant hills. Mary had offered the space for $1, which Eleanor paid without revealing the roll of bills hidden in her bag. She'd learned to be careful with money, to make it last, to never let desperation show in negotiations. The next morning, she walked out to the burned property. In daylight, the destruction looked even more complete. The house had been modest but solid, built of adobe and timber. The barn was a total loss, but the well remained intact, its stone rim cracked but serviceable. Most importantly, the land itself stretched for acres in every direction, bounded by weathered fence posts and blessed with a creek that ran year-round. "You thinking of buying it?" Eleanor turned to find a man watching her from the road. He was tall and lean, with sun-darkened skin and pale eyes that seemed to see everything. His left leg ended just below the knee, and he balanced his weight on a crutch carved from mesquite wood. "I'm thinking of it," she replied. He limped closer, each step measured and deliberate. "Name's Thomas Kane. I did some work for Jacob before the fire, built his chicken coop and mended his fences." He paused, studying her with those unsettling eyes. "You the woman he sent for?" "I was." Eleanor Walker. She used the name she'd taken when she left Chicago, borrowed from a headstone in Graceland Cemetery. Eleanor Hartwell was supposed to be dead, according to the papers she'd filed with her lawyers. Thomas nodded slowly. "Property's heading to tax auction next month. County's been trying to track down Morrison's kin, but nobody's come forward. Then I'll bid on it." He studied her more carefully, taking in her travel-stained dress, her worn boots, the determined set of her shoulders. You got the money for that? Eleanor met his gaze directly. I'll have it. That afternoon, she walked into the Sage Hollow Bank and Trust, her back straight and her voice clear as she spoke with the banker, a nervous man named Elias Cooperman. The conversation was brief and businesslike. She needed information about the auction, about taxes owed, about what it would take to claim the Morrison property. Cooperman shuffled through papers with shaking hands. Well, Miss Walker, the tax debt amounts to $47.32. But there's also the matter of back mortgage payments to consider. Eleanor placed 3 $20 gold pieces on his desk, more money than most folks in Sage Hollow saw in a year. Cooperman's eyes widened. I believe this should cover any outstanding debts, she said calmly, along with the filing fees for the deed transfer. Word of the transaction spread through town like wildfire. By evening, Eleanor could feel the weight of curious stares and whispered conversations. She took her meals at the boarding house, speaking little, listening much. The talk was all of cattle prices and water rights, of the railroad coming through and what it might mean for land values. The next morning, Thomas Kane appeared at the boarding house door, asking for her. I hear you bought the Morrison place, he said without preamble. I did. You planning to rebuild? Eleanor considered the question. She'd spent the night staring at the ceiling, thinking about what came next. Yes. You'll need help. Building in this country isn't like back east. Adobe's the way to go, but you need to know how to mix it right, how to lay it up so the walls don't crack when the storms come. Are you offering? Thomas shifted his weight on the crutch. Depends. You looking for charity or honest work? Honest work. I'll pay fair wages. He nodded once. Then we start tomorrow. The next weeks fell into a rhythm of back-breaking labor under the desert sun. Eleanor had never worked with her hands, but she learned quickly. She mixed adobe mud with straw and water, her arms aching as she stirred the heavy mixture. She helped Thomas lay out the foundation, measuring twice and checking every angle. Her soft hands blistered and calloused. Her fair skin darkened despite the wide-brimmed hat she wore. Thomas was a patient teacher, speaking little but showing her each step with quiet precision. He'd lost his leg in the war, he told her one afternoon, as they rested in the shade of the old stone chimney. A Confederate cannonball at Gettysburg had shattered bone and ended his dreams of returning to his family's farm in Tennessee. Why did you stay out here? Eleanor asked. He was quiet for a long moment, sipping water from a clay jug. Sometimes starting over means going somewhere nobody knows what you used to be. Eleanor understood that better than he knew. As the walls began to rise, other townspeople started dropping by. Mary Hutchins brought jars of her preserved peaches and offered advice about dealing with scorpions. The blacksmith, a giant of a man named Jeremiah Cross, helped salvage iron fixtures from the ruins and offered to make new ones at cost. Even the children began to linger after school, fascinated by the sight of a woman working alongside a man to build something from nothing. But not everyone in Sage Hollow welcomed Eleanor's presence. Victoria Ashford, the wife of the town's largest rancher, made her disapproval known during a chance encounter at the general store. She was a handsome woman in her 40s, dressed in the finest clothing available in the territory, her blonde hair perfectly arranged despite the heat. Miss Walker, Victoria said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. How industrious of you to take on such a project. Eleanor continued selecting supplies from the shelves, keeping her voice level. It's honest work. Oh, I'm sure it is. Though one does wonder about a woman who appears from nowhere with enough money to buy prime real estate. People are curious about your background, dear. Eleanor faced her directly. People are welcome to be curious. It doesn't obligate me to satisfy that curiosity. Victoria's smile turned sharp. Of course not. Though in a small town like ours, secrets have a way of coming to light, especially when they involve questionable claims to property. My claim is legal and properly filed, Eleanor replied. If you have evidence to the contrary, I suggest you take it up with the territorial authorities." The confrontation left Eleanor uneasy. She'd been careful to keep her past buried, but Victoria Ashford struck her as the type of woman who made it her business to know everyone else's business. That evening, she wrote a careful letter to her former attorney in Chicago, asking him to ensure all her legal affairs remained sealed. Thomas noticed her distraction the next day as they worked on framing the windows. "Something troubling you?" he asked. Eleanor hesitated, then decided on honesty. "I'm concerned that certain people in town might try to cause problems with my ownership of this land." "Victoria Ashford, you mean?" Eleanor's surprise must have shown on her face, because Thomas continued, "She's been sniffing around, asking questions about where you came from, how you had the money to buy this place. Her husband owns most of the good grazing land around here. They don't like the idea of outsiders moving in. What can they do? Depends on what they find, or what they think they can prove." He set down his hammer and looked at her seriously. "You got something to hide?" Eleanor met his gaze. "Everyone has something to hide." "That's not an answer." She was quiet for a long moment, weighing trust against necessity. Finally she spoke. "I had a different name once, a different life. I gave it up to come here." Thomas nodded slowly. Sometimes that's the only choice a person has. A month after Eleanor bought the land, a stranger rode into town. He was a well-dressed man in his 50s, with silver hair and calculating eyes, riding a horse that cost more than most folks earned in a year. He took a room at the boarding house and began asking questions. Eleanor learned of his arrival from Mary Hutchins, who knocked on her door that evening with a worried expression. "There's a man here asking about you," Mary said without preamble. "Says he's a private investigator from back east. Got papers and everything." Eleanor's blood turned to ice. "What kind of papers?" "Don't know exactly. But he's been talking to Victoria Ashford, and you know that can't be good." That night, Eleanor sat on her half-built porch, staring out at the star-scattered sky. The house was taking shape around her, walls rising like hope made solid. But the past had found her again, as she'd always known it would. The next morning, the stranger appeared at her construction site. He introduced himself as Detective Marcus Webb, hired by the Hartwell Mining Company to locate their missing heiress. "Miss Eleanor Hartwell," he said, tipping his hat with mock courtesy. "Or do you prefer Walker these days?" Eleanor continued working, not looking up from the adobe brick she was placing. "I'm not sure what you mean." Webb chuckled. "Oh, I think you do. The runaway heiress who disappeared 2 years ago after refusing to marry the man her father's board selected. Left quite a mess behind from what I understand. Stock prices plummeted. Investors got nervous. Sounds like a business problem, not a legal one." "Well, that's where it gets interesting." Webb pulled a folded document from his coat. "Seems there's been some question about the legitimacy of your withdrawal from the company. New evidence suggests your signatures on the divestment papers might have been irregular." Eleanor finally looked up, her hand stilling on the brick. "That's impossible. I signed those documents myself." "Maybe. Or maybe a desperate woman forged her own name to steal what wasn't rightfully hers." Webb's smile was cold. "Either way, the company wants its assets back, and they're prepared to offer you a generous settlement to avoid any unpleasantness." Thomas appeared at the edge of the worksite, his crutch making soft sounds in the dirt as he approached. He'd been hauling water from the well, but now he set down the buckets and studied the stranger with steady eyes. "Problem here?" Thomas asked quietly. Webb glanced at him dismissively. "No problem at all. Just discussing some family business with Miss Hartwell here." "Miss Walker?" Thomas corrected. "And unless you're here to help with the building, maybe you should move along." Webb's smile widened. "Actually, I think I'll be staying in town for a while, just to make sure everything gets resolved properly." After Webb left, Eleanor sat heavily on a pile of lumber. The weight of her past pressed down like the desert sun, relentless and inescapable. "How bad is it?" Thomas asked, settling beside her with a grunt. Eleanor was quiet for a long time. Then, slowly, she told him everything. About the mining fortune built by her grandfather. About her father's death and the board's attempt to control her through marriage. About her decision to walk away from everything rather than be owned by men who saw her as nothing more than a signature on documents they wanted to control. "I thought I'd covered my tracks," she finished. "I filed all the proper papers, divested myself legally. But now they're saying you didn't? They're saying whatever serves their purpose." Eleanor's voice was bitter. "They want the company back under their control, and they'll destroy me to get it." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "What do you want to do?" Eleanor looked at the rising walls of her house, at the desert stretching endlessly toward the horizon. "I want to finish what we started." "Then that's what we'll do." But Webb wasn't content to wait quietly. Over the next few days, he made himself known throughout Sage Hollow, spreading rumors and raising questions about Eleanor's legitimacy. He met with Victoria Ashford repeatedly, and soon whispers began to circulate about the mysterious woman who'd bought the Morrison place with suspicious money. The situation came to a head during Sunday services at the small church. Eleanor had been attending regularly, partly for the comfort of routine and partly to show the townspeople that she was a respectable member of their community. But this Sunday, as she sat in her usual pew near the back, she felt the weight of stares more keenly than ever. After the service, as people gathered outside to visit, Victoria Ashford approached with Webb at her side. "Miss Walker," Victoria said loudly enough for others to hear, "Mr. Webb here has been telling us such interesting things about your background." Eleanor stood her ground, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "Has he?" "Indeed," Victoria continued, her voice carrying across the churchyard. "It seems you may not be who you claim to be." A crowd was gathering now, drawn by the drama unfolding in their midst. Eleanor saw Mary Hutchins frown with concern, saw Jeremiah Cross step closer as if ready to intervene. Webb stepped forward, his voice smooth and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid I have some disturbing news about your new neighbor. The woman calling herself Eleanor Walker is actually Eleanor Hartwell, heiress to a mining fortune back east. She's currently under investigation for embezzlement and fraud." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Eleanor felt the familiar sensation of the ground shifting beneath her feet, the same feeling she'd experienced in those terrible board meetings back in Chicago. But then Thomas was beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. "That's a serious accusation," Thomas said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "You got proof of these charges?" Webb smiled confidently. "I have documents. Legal documents, court orders, arrest warrants." Thomas's questions were precise, cutting. "Because accusations are easy to make, proof is harder to come by." Webb's confidence flickered slightly. "The investigation is ongoing." "Then, until it's concluded, seems to me folks ought to reserve judgment," Thomas said. He turned to address the crowd. "I've worked alongside Eleanor Walker for weeks now. I've seen her character, her honesty, the way she treats people. That's worth more than whispers from strangers." Mary Hutchins stepped forward. "She's paid her debts honest and helped folks when they needed it. That's good enough for me." One by one, others began to speak up. The schoolteacher mentioned how Eleanor had donated books for the children. The doctor's wife recalled Eleanor nursing her through a fever. Small kindnesses, honest dealings, the currency of trust in a small community. Webb's face darkened as he realized his carefully planned revelation was backfiring. "You people don't understand what you're dealing with." "We understand enough," Jeremiah Cross rumbled, his massive frame casting a shadow over the detective. "Seems to me you've said your piece. Maybe it's time you moved on." Webb looked around the hostile faces and apparently decided discretion was the better part of valor. "This isn't over," he said to Eleanor. "The truth has a way of coming out." As the crowd dispersed, Eleanor found herself surrounded by neighbors offering support, and encouragement. The warmth of their acceptance almost brought tears to her eyes. That evening, as she and Thomas worked by lamplight on the interior walls of her house, she finally asked the question that had been haunting her. "Why did you defend me? You don't really know who I am or what I've done." Thomas paused in his work, considering the question. "I know you could have taken the easy path and married whoever your family wanted. Instead, you chose the hard road. I know you work until your hands bleed and never complain. I know you treat people with respect, regardless of their station." He met her eyes. "That tells me everything I need to know about who you are." Eleanor felt something warm unfurl in her chest, something she hadn't dared acknowledge until now. "Thomas," he set down his tools and moved closer. "I know we haven't talked about this, about what's growing between us. I didn't want to presume." She silenced him with a kiss, soft and tentative at first, then deepening as he responded. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. "I never expected this," she whispered. "When I came here, I thought I was just running away. And now? Now I think I was running towards something I didn't even know I was looking for." But their moment of peace was short-lived. The next morning brought news that Webb had filed a complaint with the territorial marshal, claiming Eleanor was a fugitive from justice. A formal hearing would be held to determine whether she should be arrested and extradited back to Chicago. Eleanor sat in her unfinished kitchen, staring at the official notice. Everything she'd built, everything she'd found, hung in the balance. "We'll fight it," Thomas said firmly. "Get you a good lawyer." "With what money?" Eleanor laughed bitterly. "I spent almost everything I had on this land, this house. I can't afford to fight a legal battle against people with unlimited resources." "Then we'll find another way." Eleanor shook her head. "There is no other way. They've got me trapped, just like they always planned to." But Thomas was studying the documents with a shrewd expression. "Maybe not. Look at this. The complaint is filed by the Hartwell Mining Company, claiming you embezzled company funds. But didn't you say you legally divested yourself of all company holdings?" "I did, but they're claiming the documents were fraudulent." "Claims ain't proof. And if you've got your original papers, signed and notarized, that might be enough to counter their accusations." Eleanor felt a flicker of hope. "I kept copies of everything. They're hidden in my room at the boarding house." "Then that's our starting point." The hearing was set for the following Friday in the courthouse at Tucson, a day's hard ride from Sage Hollow. Eleanor spent the intervening week gathering every document she could find, every piece of evidence that supported her claim to have legally severed ties with the mining company. To her surprise, when the day came to leave for Tucson, she found herself accompanied not just by Thomas, but by half the town of Sage Hollow. Mary Hutchins had organized a caravan of wagons carrying witnesses willing to testify to Eleanor's character. The show of support overwhelmed her. The territorial courthouse was the imposing adobe building in the heart of Tucson. Inside, the hearing room was packed with observers, Eleanor's supporters from Sage Hollow on one side, Webb and several well-dressed men she didn't recognize on the other. The territorial judge was a weathered man named Samuel Morrison, who listened carefully as Webb presented his case. The detective painted Eleanor as a scheming woman who had defrauded her own family's company and fled west to escape justice. When it was Eleanor's turn to speak, she stood slowly, her legs trembling beneath her skirts, but her voice was steady as she began to tell her story. She spoke of her grandfather's vision for a mining company that would treat its workers fairly and share its profits with the communities where it operated. She told of her father's gradual shift away from those principles under pressure from board members more interested in profit than people. She described the aftermath of her father's death, when those same board members had tried to force her into a marriage that would give them complete control over the company. "I didn't steal anything," she said, her voice ringing clearly through the courtroom. "I gave up everything, my inheritance, my social position, my very identity, rather than be a party to the exploitation they planned. I have the legal documents to prove it. She presented her carefully preserved papers, the formal divestment agreement, the notarized signatures, the witness attestations. Webb's lawyer examined them closely, looking for flaws, but the documents were ironclad. The judge studied the papers for a long time. Finally, he looked up. "Mr. Webb, these documents appear to be in proper order. They show that Miss Hartwell legally relinquished all claim to company assets 2 years ago. On what basis do you claim she embezzled company funds?" Webb's confidence was finally beginning to crack. "Your Honor, we have reason to believe those signatures were forged." "Reason to believe isn't evidence," Judge Morrison said sharply. "Do you have handwriting analysis? Testimony from witnesses who observed forgery?" Webb's silence was answer enough. The judge banged his gavel. "This complaint is dismissed. Miss Walker, or Miss Hartwell, as you prefer, is free to go. And Mr. Webb, I suggest you be very careful about bringing unsubstantiated accusations before this court in the future." The courtroom erupted in cheers from the Sage Hollow delegation. Eleanor felt her knees go weak with relief, and Thomas was there to steady her, his strong arm around her waist. Outside the courthouse, Webb made one last attempt to regain control. "This isn't over, Eleanor," he said, his voice low and threatening. "The company will find other ways to bring you back." Eleanor looked at him with pity rather than fear. "Tell them Eleanor Hartwell is dead and buried. Tell them Eleanor Walker has found something they can never understand, a place where she belongs not because of what she owns, but because of who she chooses to be." The journey back to Sage Hollow felt like a victory parade. Eleanor rode in the lead wagon with Thomas, her hand clasped in his, watching the familiar landscape roll past. For the first time since she'd fled Chicago, she felt truly free. The house was completed by autumn, just as the first cool weather brought relief from the summer heat. It was a simple structure by the standards Eleanor had grown up with, but it felt more like home than any mansion ever had. The walls were thick adobe that kept the interior cool in summer and warm in winter. The windows faced east to catch the morning light, and west to frame spectacular sunsets over the desert. The day they moved Eleanor's few possessions from the boarding house to her new home, Thomas made an announcement that surprised no one. "I've been thinking," he said as they stood in the main room, "this house is too big for one person." Eleanor smiled. "Is it?" "Definitely. Seems like it was built for a family." "And what did you have in mind to remedy that situation?" Instead of answering with words, Thomas dropped to one knee, pulling a simple gold band from his pocket. "Eleanor Walker, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Through tears of joy, she whispered, "Yes." They were married the following spring, in a ceremony held in the courtyard of their adobe home. The entire town of Sage Hollow attended, along with visitors from Tucson and even Phoenix. Eleanor wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved through all her travels, and Thomas wore a suit he'd had specially tailored in Tucson for the occasion. As they exchanged vows under the blooming mesquite trees, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had lost a fortune, but gained something infinitely more valuable: a love built on mutual respect, shared labor, and absolute trust. The years that followed brought challenges and triumphs in equal measure. Drought years tested their resolve, but the well never went dry. Good years brought prosperity that they shared generously with their neighbors. Thomas's carpentry business thrived as more settlers arrived in the territory, drawn by tales of opportunity in the desert. Eleanor established the territory's first library, using her Eastern connections to acquire books for the growing community. She also started a school for children whose parents couldn't afford formal education, teaching reading and arithmetic in the front room of their home. 5 years after their wedding, Eleanor gave birth to twin daughters. She and Thomas named them Hope and Grace, determined that their children would grow up knowing they could be anything they chose to be. One evening, as Eleanor sat on her porch watching Thomas teach their daughters to carve wooden animals, a letter arrived from Chicago. It was from her old lawyer, informing her that the Hartwell Mining Company had finally collapsed under the weight of poor management and worker strikes. The board members who had tried to control her were bankrupt and disgraced. Eleanor read the letter twice, then walked to the fireplace and fed it to the flames. The past was truly dead now, leaving only the future stretching ahead like the endless desert sky. "Any regrets?" Thomas asked that night as they lay in bed, listening to the coyotes sing in the hills. Eleanor considered the question seriously. She thought of the luxury she'd given up, the social position she'd abandoned, the fortune she'd walked away from. "Not a single one," she said, and meant it. Outside their window, the desert bloomed with life that most people never saw. Tiny flowers that emerged after rain, careful creatures that thrived in harsh conditions, an entire ecosystem built on resilience and adaptation. Like her new life, it was beautiful not in spite of its challenges, but because of them. Eleanor Hartwell had died in a Chicago boardroom, but Eleanor Walker had been born in the ashes of a burned homestead. And in the end, that trade, everything she'd been for everything she'd chosen to become, was the best bargain she'd ever made. The desert had taught her that sometimes the most beautiful things grew in the harshest places, that sometimes losing everything was just another way of finding what you'd been looking for all along. She'd come west as a runaway heiress, but she'd become something better, a woman who belonged exactly where she was, who'd built her own fortune out of adobe and determination and love. As the stars wheeled overhead and the desert wind whispered through the mesquite, Eleanor Walker Kane smiled and slept the deep, dreamless sleep of someone who was exactly where she belonged. But even as Eleanor basked in the afterglow of victory, she knew that Webb's defeat was only the beginning. Men like him didn't give up easily, and the mining company's board had too much at stake to simply walk away. She was proven right 3 months later when a new threat emerged from an unexpected direction. It started with a survey crew appearing on the horizon one scorching August morning. Eleanor spotted them from her kitchen window as she prepared breakfast, their instruments glinting in the early sun as they took measurements along the creek that bordered her property. Thomas was already in his workshop, the rhythmic sound of his plane shaving wood carrying across the yard. "Thomas," she called, wiping her hands on her apron, "there are men surveying near the creek." He appeared in the doorway, sawdust in his hair and a frown creasing his weathered face. "Surveyors? Nobody told me about any territorial surveys scheduled for this area." Together they walked to the fence line where the crew was working. The lead surveyor, a thin man in a dusty brown suit, looked up from his transit as they approached. "Morning," he said with professional courtesy. "Name's Harrison Mills. We're conducting a boundary survey for the new railroad easement." Eleanor felt her stomach drop. "Railroad easement?" Mills consulted his papers. "Yes, ma'am. The Southwestern and Pacific Railroad has purchased easement rights through this valley. We're marking the boundaries for the right-of-way." Thomas stepped forward. "Purchased from who?" "This is private land." "Well, that's where it gets complicated," Mills admitted. "Seems there's been some question about certain property titles in this area. The railroad's lawyers have been working with the territorial government to resolve any disputed claims." Eleanor's blood turned to ice. She recognized the hand of her enemies in this new development. Unable to destroy her through the courts, they were trying to take her land through bureaucratic maneuvering. "I'll need to see those easement documents," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. Mills shrugged. "Don't have them with me. You'd need to contact the railroad's legal department in Phoenix." That afternoon, Eleanor rode hard to the telegraph office in town, Thomas beside her despite his disability making riding difficult. The telegraph operator, a nervous young man named Jimmy Pierce, took down her urgent message to her lawyer in Chicago. The reply came 2 days later, and the news was worse than she'd feared. The Hartwell Mining Company, in its final desperate months before collapse, had sold information about Eleanor's new identity and location to the railroad interests. They'd used forged documents claiming an earlier invalid deed to the Morrison property, suggesting that Eleanor's purchase had been fraudulent. "It's all lies," Eleanor said, crumpling the telegram in her fist. But by the time we can prove it in court, they'll have already started construction. Thomas studied the surveyor's marks that now dotted their property like a rash. Railroads got deep pockets and political connections. They can tie up our land in legal proceedings for years while they build their tracks. Eleanor stared out at the home they'd built together, at the neat rows of vegetables in their garden, at the chicken coop where Thomas's handiwork showed in every carefully fitted board. The thought of losing it all to another wave of Eastern manipulation made her feel sick. There has to be something we can do. Maybe there is, Thomas said slowly, but it'll require help from some folks who might not want to get involved. That evening, they sat in their kitchen with an unlikely gathering. Mary Hutchins was there, her usually cheerful face set in grim lines. Jeremiah Cross had closed his blacksmith shop early to attend, his massive frame filling one of their sturdy wooden chairs. Dr. Samuel Morrison had ridden out from town, along with the banker Cooperman, who kept wringing his hands nervously. The railroad's been buying up land all through the valley, Dr. Morrison explained. They're offering good money for willing sellers, but using legal pressure against anyone who won't sell. Jeremiah's voice rumbled like distant thunder. They came to me last week, said they needed my shop for their depot, offered twice what the business is worth, but told me I could sell, willing or unwilling, my choice. It's not just about the money, Mary added. They're planning to bring in hundreds of workers, mostly rough men with no ties to the community. Sage Hollow won't be the same place anymore. Eleanor felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Her past had brought this threat to their door, but it was the entire community that would suffer for it. What if we fight together? She asked. Pool our resources, hire lawyers, challenge them in court. Cooperman shook his head mournfully. The railroad's got lawyers in every territorial capital. They know how to work the system better than we do. Then we'll have to work outside the system, Thomas said quietly. Everyone turned to look at him. He was staring out the window toward the distant mountains, his expression thoughtful. What do you mean? Dr. Morrison asked. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked around the table at the faces of his neighbors and friends. I mean, we make it too expensive for them to build through here, make them want to choose a different route. How? Jeremiah's voice was skeptical but interested. Accidents happen during construction. Equipment breaks down. Workers get discouraged and move on to easier jobs. Thomas's voice was level, matter of fact. Nothing violent, nothing that would hurt anybody, just complications. Eleanor stared at her husband, seeing a side of him she'd never witnessed before. There was steel beneath his quiet exterior, forged in the fires of war and hardship. That's sabotage, Cooperman whispered, his face pale. We could all be arrested. Only if we get caught, Mary said grimly, and only if there's proof it wasn't just bad luck and incompetent planning. Over the following weeks, a strange sort of planning session evolved in the Kane household. By day, Eleanor and Thomas went about their normal routines, tending their garden, working in the shop, maintaining the facade of ordinary frontier life. But by evening, their kitchen became a meeting place for what Thomas jokingly called the Sage Hollow Improvement Society. The railroad's advance team arrived in September, setting up camp along the creek and beginning preliminary work on the roadbed. They were led by a foreman named Rex Dalton, a big man with cruel eyes and a reputation for getting things done regardless of the cost to local communities. Dalton wasted no time making his presence felt. He posted notices around town declaring that all property within a quarter-mile of the planned track was subject to eminent domain seizure. He brought in a crew of surveyors who trampled through private gardens and corrals without permission, measuring and marking as if they already owned everything in sight. The first accident happened 3 days after construction began. Eleanor was hanging laundry behind her house when she heard the shouts and commotion from the work site. A supply wagon had somehow lost its wheel while crossing the creek, spilling lumber and hardware into the muddy water. The driver was unhurt but furious, claiming someone had loosened the wheel nuts during the night. Thomas appeared beside her, wiping his hands on a rag. "Shame about that wagon," he said mildly. Good thing nobody was hurt. Eleanor studied his face, seeing nothing but genuine concern for the driver's welfare. But she noticed sawdust under his fingernails despite the fact that he'd been working with metal all morning. The incidents continued over the following days. A pile of rails mysteriously shifted overnight, blocking the road into town. A surveyor's transit disappeared, only to be found days later at the bottom of the creek, its delicate mechanisms ruined by water damage. A string of pack mules broke loose and scattered, carrying essential supplies deep into the desert where it took days to track them down. Each incident on its own could be explained as simple misfortune or carelessness, but taken together, they created a pattern of delays and frustrations that had Dalton cursing and his workers grumbling about the job. Eleanor found herself walking a tightrope between admiration for her neighbor's ingenuity and worry about the consequences if they were caught. She knew the railroad had resources far beyond what their small community could match, and she feared what would happen if the company decided to make an example of Sage Hollow. Her fears proved justified when Dalton began hiring guards, hard men with guns who patrolled the work sites and watched the townspeople with suspicious eyes. The easy camaraderie that had developed among the Improvement Society members became strained as the risk of discovery increased. The crisis came to a head on a hot October morning when one of Dalton's guards caught Jimmy Pierce, the telegraph operator, near a pile of construction materials. Jimmy was just a boy, barely 18, and he panicked when confronted. Instead of walking away casually, he ran. The guard's shot echoed across the valley like thunder. Jimmy stumbled and fell, blood spreading across his shirt from a wound in his shoulder. By the time Thomas and Eleanor reached him, half the town was gathered around the boy's still form. "He was trying to steal our supplies," Dalton declared, holstering his smoking pistol. "My man had every right to defend railroad property." Dr. Morrison knelt beside Jimmy, pressing a cloth against the wound. "This boy's never stolen so much as an apple in his life. You shot an innocent young man." "Innocent men don't run when they're caught where they shouldn't be," Dalton replied coldly. Eleanor felt rage building in her chest, hot and dangerous. She'd seen too much violence in her life, too many good people hurt by those with power and no conscience. But before she could speak, Thomas laid a restraining hand on her arm. "Doc, will the boy live?" Thomas asked quietly. "He'll be fine, but he needs rest and care." Thomas nodded, then looked directly at Dalton. "Seems to me you've got a choice to make, mister. You can keep pushing folks until someone pushes back harder than you expect, or you can find a way to work with the community instead of against it." Dalton laughed harshly. "Work with you people? We don't need your cooperation. We've got legal right to this land, and we've got the men to enforce that right." "Legal right based on fraudulent documents," Eleanor said, stepping forward despite Thomas's restraining grip. "I've seen the papers your company filed. They're forgeries." Dalton's eyes narrowed as he studied her more carefully. "You're the Hartwell woman, the one who's been causing so much trouble. I'm Eleanor Kane, and this is my home. You have no legitimate claim to it." "We'll see about that." Dalton turned to his men. "Double the guard shifts. Anyone found near railroad property after dark gets the same treatment as the telegraph boy." As the crowd dispersed, Eleanor felt the weight of the community's situation pressing down on her. The escalation to violence changed everything. What had begun as minor sabotage could now become open warfare, with innocent people caught in the crossfire. That night, the Improvement Society gathered one final time in the Kane kitchen. The mood was somber, the easy confidence of earlier meetings replaced by grim determination. "We can't keep this up," Dr. Morrison said bluntly. "Not with armed guards shooting at our children." "So we just give up?" Jeremiah's voice was bitter. "Let them steal our homes and destroy our town?" "Maybe there's another way," Eleanor said quietly. She'd been thinking all afternoon, weighing options and possibilities. "What if we expose their fraud publicly? Make such a scandal that the railroad has to back down?" Thomas frowned. "How?" "We don't have any big newspapers or politicians on our side." "No, but I know someone who does." Eleanor took a breath, knowing that what she was about to propose would require her to risk everything she'd built. I still have contacts back east, people who knew my family, who might be willing to help if they knew the full story. That means revealing who you really are, Mary pointed out. Everything you've worked to keep secret. Eleanor nodded slowly. I know, but maybe it's time to stop running from the past and start using it as a weapon. The next morning, Eleanor composed the most important letter of her life. It was addressed to Margaret Sinclair, daughter of a newspaper publisher who had been one of her mother's closest friends. In careful, precise language, Eleanor explained everything: her flight from Chicago, her new life in Arizona, and the railroad's fraudulent attempt to steal her land. I'm not asking for charity, she wrote. I'm asking for justice. The same forces that tried to control me in Chicago are now threatening an entire community of good people who want nothing more than to live their lives in peace. If there's any way your father's newspaper might be interested in this story, I would be grateful for the chance to tell it properly. Thomas rode with her to the telegraph office to send the letter, both of them aware that they were crossing a line from which there might be no return. If Eleanor's gamble failed, they would have lost their anonymity for nothing. If it succeeded, their quiet life in Sage Hollow would be over forever. The reply came faster than Eleanor had dared hope. Margaret Sinclair's telegram was brief but promising. Father very interested. Stop sending reporter immediately. Stop, hold nothing back. Stop your friend always Margaret. 3 days later, a dust-covered man stepped down from the eastbound stage. He introduced himself as Andrew Whitman, correspondent for the Chicago Tribune, and his first request was to see the forged documents the railroad was using to claim Eleanor's property. Eleanor spent hours with Whitman, walking him through the entire story from her escape from Chicago to the current crisis. He took careful notes, asking pointed questions, and examining every piece of evidence she could provide. This is bigger than just your situation, he told her, as they sat on her front porch in the evening shade. We've been hearing reports of similar railroad land grabs all across the territories. If I can prove fraud here, it might expose a pattern of corruption that reaches all the way to Washington. But Whitman's presence didn't go unnoticed by Dalton and his men. The next morning, Eleanor found the reporter's room at the boarding house ransacked, and his notes scattered across the floor. Professional hazard, Whitman said philosophically as he gathered the torn papers. But they made a mistake. I always keep my real notes someplace safer. He tapped his temple with a grin. 40 years of newspaper work teaches a man to remember what's important. While Whitman worked on his story, the situation at the work site continued to deteriorate. Dalton had brought in more guards, and the atmosphere in Sage Hollow grew increasingly tense. Townspeople went about their business under the watchful eyes of armed men, and even casual conversations were conducted in whispers. The breaking point came when Dalton decided to make an example of someone. He chose Thomas, perhaps sensing that the quiet carpenter was at the center of the resistance movement. Eleanor was in the general store when she heard the commotion outside. Through the window, she saw Thomas surrounded by 4 of Dalton's guards, their hands resting on their gun butts in clear threat. Seems like a lot of accidents been happening around our work site, Dalton was saying as Eleanor pushed through the crowd that had gathered. Funny how they always seem to happen near your property. Thomas stood perfectly still, his crutch planted firmly in the dirt, his eyes never leaving Dalton's face. Accidents happen, especially when folks are working in unfamiliar country. Maybe some people need to be taught a lesson about interfering with railroad business. Eleanor felt ice form in her veins. She recognized the tone, the casual threat wrapped in reasonable words. She'd heard it before in Chicago boardrooms when men were about to destroy someone who stood in their way. Thomas. She stepped through the crowd, moving to stand beside her husband. Is there a problem here? Dalton's smile was cold and predatory. Just having a friendly conversation with your husband about the importance of good community relations. Then I'm sure you won't mind if I join the conversation. Before Dalton could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. Actually, I'd like to join it too. Everyone turned to see Andrew Whitman approaching, his notebook in one hand and a camera in the other. Behind him walked a tall man in an expensive suit who carried himself with the unmistakable air of authority. "Gentlemen," the tall man said, his voice carrying clearly across the street, "I'm Judge William Harrison from the Territorial Court in Phoenix. I've come to investigate reports of irregularities in the railroad's land acquisition procedures." Dalton's face went white. "Judge Harrison? We weren't expecting." "No, I imagine you weren't." Harrison's eyes swept over the armed guards, the frightened townspeople, the general atmosphere of intimidation. "Mr. Whitman here has made some very serious allegations about forged documents and fraudulent land claims. I think it's time we got to the bottom of this situation." What followed was 3 days of testimony, document examination, and investigation that transformed Sage Hollow into something resembling a courtroom. Eleanor testified about the forged papers, presenting her original deeds and contracts as evidence. Thomas and other townspeople described the pattern of intimidation and violence. Even young Jimmy Pierce, still recovering from his gunshot wound, gave testimony about what he'd witnessed at the construction site. But the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source. One of Dalton's own workers, a man named Pete Collins, who'd grown disgusted with his employer's methods, came forward with information about bribes paid to territorial officials and documents deliberately altered to support false claims. Judge Harrison listened to everything with the patient thoroughness of a man accustomed to untangling complex webs of deception. On the third evening, he rendered his decision from the steps of the courthouse. "Based on the evidence presented," he announced to the crowd that had gathered, "I find that the Southwestern and Pacific Railroad's claim to an easement through this valley is based on fraudulent documentation. All construction is hereby suspended pending a full investigation by federal authorities." The cheer that went up from the townspeople could probably be heard in Phoenix. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face as neighbors embraced and children danced in the dusty street. But even in the moment of victory, she knew that the larger battle was far from over. Dalton and his crew packed up and left the next morning, their wagons loaded with unused equipment and wounded pride. But before departing, Dalton made one final threat. "This isn't finished," he told Eleanor as she watched the convoy prepare to leave. "The railroad has a long memory and deep pockets. We'll find another way." Eleanor met his glare without flinching. "Then you'll find me ready." Andrew Whitman's story appeared in newspapers across the country, exposing not just the fraud in Sage Hollow, but a broader pattern of railroad corruption throughout the Western Territories. The scandal reached all the way to Washington, where congressional hearings were called, and several high-ranking officials were forced to resign. For Eleanor, the victory was bittersweet. She'd won the battle to save her home, but at the cost of the anonymity she'd worked so hard to maintain. The story made her a public figure again, the Desert Rose of Arizona, who'd given up a mining fortune to fight railroad corruption in the territories. Letters began arriving from across the country, some supportive, others critical, all proof that her quiet life in Sage Hollow was over forever. Reporters made the journey to interview the woman who'd become a symbol of frontier resistance. Eastern Society ladies wrote to express their shock that one of their own had chosen to live in such primitive conditions. "Do you regret it?" Thomas asked one evening as they sat on their porch, watching yet another curious visitor ride away. "Giving up your privacy to save the town?" Eleanor considered the question seriously. The attention was exhausting, and she sometimes longed for the simple days when her biggest worry was whether the garden needed watering. But then she looked around at the community that had rallied to support her, at the home she'd built with her own hands, at the man who'd stood beside her through every crisis. "No," she said finally. "This is where I belong. If fighting for it means giving up some peace and quiet, then that's a price worth paying." The railroad's defeat had unexpected consequences beyond saving Sage Hollow. Word of the community's successful resistance spread throughout the territory, inspiring other towns to stand up against similar threats. Eleanor found herself receiving visitors from across Arizona and New Mexico, people seeking advice on how to organize their own communities against corporate intimidation. Somewhat reluctantly, She found herself becoming a reluctant expert on territorial land law and community organizing. She corresponded with lawyers and politicians, helping to draft legislation that would make it harder for companies to use fraudulent claims to steal private property. Thomas watched his wife's transformation with a mixture of pride and concern. The shy woman who'd arrived in Sage Hollow, claiming to be a mail-order bride, had evolved into a formidable advocate for frontier justice. But he could see the toll the constant attention was taking on her. "Maybe we should think about moving," he suggested one evening after a particularly trying day dealing with reporters and curious visitors. "Find someplace quieter where we can just be ourselves." Eleanor looked shocked at the suggestion. "Move? This is our home, Thomas. We built it together. We could build another one. Someplace where Eleanor Kane can just be Eleanor Kane, not the famous Desert Rose." For a moment, Eleanor was tempted. The idea of starting fresh again, of returning to the simple life they'd enjoyed before the railroad crisis, held genuine appeal. But then she thought about all the other communities facing similar threats, all the people who needed someone to stand up for them. "I can't run away again," she said quietly. "I spent too many years running from responsibility. If people are willing to listen to what I have to say, then I have an obligation to say it." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Eleanor opened it to find a young woman in dusty traveling clothes, her face bearing the exhausted look of someone who'd traveled far and fast. "Mrs. Kane? My name is Sarah Mitchell. I've come from Silver Creek, New Mexico. We need your help." Over coffee and Mary Hutchins' apple pie, Sarah told a story that was all too familiar. A mining company was using forged documents and bribed officials to claim an entire valley that had been homesteaded by dozens of families. Local law enforcement was either corrupted or intimidated into compliance. The community was facing eviction within weeks unless something could be done. Eleanor listened with growing anger, recognizing the same tactics that had nearly destroyed Sage Hollow. When Sarah finished her story, Eleanor didn't hesitate. "I'll come with you," she said. "We'll need to gather evidence, find honest lawyers, and get the story to newspapers that aren't afraid to print the truth." Thomas sighed, but nodded. He'd known this moment was coming, had seen it in the set of his wife's shoulders whenever another letter arrived asking for help. "I'll come too," he said. "Somebody needs to watch your back." Eleanor squeezed his hand gratefully. "It might be dangerous. These mining companies play harder than the railroad did. Then it's a good thing I learned a few things about fighting dirty during the war." They left Sage Hollow the next morning, riding toward New Mexico and another battle against corporate corruption. But this time, Eleanor wasn't running away from her past. She was embracing a future she was choosing to build. The fight in Silver Creek proved to be everything Eleanor had expected and more. The mining company had deeper pockets than the railroad and fewer scruples about using violence to achieve their goals. Eleanor found herself dodging hired gunmen while trying to gather evidence of fraud, sleeping in different places every night to avoid assassination attempts. But she also discovered something she hadn't expected: a network of communities throughout the territories that were facing similar threats. Small towns and homesteading families who'd been fighting their battles in isolation began to connect with each other, sharing information and resources. What started as a mission to save one New Mexican valley evolved into something much larger: the beginnings of a territorial-wide movement to protect settlers' rights against corporate exploitation. Eleanor found herself at the center of this movement, not because she'd sought leadership, but because her victory in Sage Hollow had made her a symbol of what was possible when communities stood together. She traveled constantly, speaking at town meetings, helping to organize legal challenges, and working with honest journalists to expose corruption wherever they found it. Thomas stayed by her side through it all, his steady presence and practical skills invaluable in the dangerous work they were doing. He'd traded his carpenter's tools for a Winchester rifle and had learned to watch for trouble with the same careful attention he'd once devoted to measuring lumber. Their marriage deepened and strengthened through the shared challenges. They were partners in every sense, working together toward goals that mattered more than personal comfort or safety. The mining company's defeat in Silver Creek led to congressional investigations, that reached even higher levels of government than the railroad scandal had. By the time Eleanor and Thomas returned to Sage Hollow, they'd helped expose a web of corruption that stretched from territorial capitals to Washington, D.C. But victory came at a price. Eleanor's health had suffered from the constant stress and travel. She was thinner than she'd been when they married, and Thomas noticed gray threads appearing in her dark hair. More concerning to him was the haunted look that sometimes appeared in her eyes, the weight of carrying so many people's hopes and fears. "Maybe it's time to step back," he suggested as they sat in their own kitchen for the first time in months. "Let someone else carry the load for a while." Eleanor knew he was right. She could feel the exhaustion in her bones, the toll that constant fighting had taken on her spirit. But even as she nodded agreement, both of them knew that stepping back wouldn't be easy. The letters still came every day, desperate pleas from communities under threat, requests for advice and assistance that Eleanor found impossible to ignore. The decision was made for them when Eleanor collapsed during a speaking engagement in Tucson. Thomas found her unconscious on the stage, having pushed herself beyond the limits of physical endurance. The doctor's diagnosis was exhaustion complicated by the lingering effects of stress and poor nutrition. He prescribed complete rest for at least 3 months, away from all the pressures and responsibilities that had been consuming Eleanor's life. "You've done enough," Thomas told her as she lay recovering in their bedroom back in Sage Hollow. "More than enough. The movement you helped start is strong enough now to continue without you." Eleanor wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. The network of communities they'd helped organize was functioning independently now, with local leaders who no longer needed her constant guidance. The legal precedents they'd established were being used by other lawyers in other cases. The corruption they'd exposed was being investigated by federal authorities, who had the resources to see the job through. For the first time since the railroad crisis began, Eleanor allowed herself to truly rest. She spent her days in the garden, tending vegetables and desert roses with the same careful attention she'd once devoted to legal strategies. She read books for pleasure instead of searching for legal precedents. She and Thomas took long walks in the evenings, talking about simple things like weather and crops and the small daily details of life in Sage Hollow. Slowly, her health returned. The haunted look faded from her eyes, replaced by the contentment Thomas remembered from their early days together. They began talking about the future again, not the movement's future, but their own. "I want children," Eleanor said one evening, as they watched the sunset paint the desert mountains purple and gold. "I want to raise them here, in this place we've fought so hard to protect." Thomas smiled, the first genuinely relaxed smile she'd seen from him in months. "I'd like that too, more than you know." Their first child was born the following spring, a daughter they named Hope in honor of what their community had represented to so many people. 2 years later came a son, Daniel, named for Thomas's brother, who died at Gettysburg. Eleanor threw herself into motherhood with the same intensity she'd once devoted to fighting corruption. She was determined that her children would grow up knowing they could choose their own paths, that they could be anything they decided to become. The movement Eleanor had helped start continued to grow and evolve, but without her direct involvement. Younger leaders took over the work, building on the foundations she and Thomas had helped establish. Occasionally, they would receive visitors who wanted to thank the famous Desert Rose for her contributions, but for the most part, Eleanor Kane was able to fade back into the anonymity she'd always preferred. The years that followed the territorial investigations were transformative not just for Eleanor and Thomas, but for the entire American West. The exposure of the railroad and mining company corruption had ripple effects that reached far beyond the borders of Arizona Territory. Congressional hearings led to new federal legislation protecting settlers' rights. Territorial governments were restructured to reduce the influence of corporate money. A generation of lawyers and activists, inspired by Eleanor's example, took up the cause of fighting corporate abuse in frontier communities. Eleanor found herself reluctantly famous, a symbol of resistance against corporate power that she'd never intended to become. Letters arrived daily from across the country, some praising her courage, others condemning her for interfering with progress and economic development. Eastern newspapers wrote editorials both supporting and criticizing her methods. She even received marriage proposals from men who'd never met her, but were apparently impressed by her reputation. "Listen to this one," Thomas said one morning as he sorted through the latest batch of correspondence. "Dear Mrs. Kane, I am a prosperous merchant in San Francisco who greatly admires your spirit and independence. Should you ever tire of your current situation, I would be honored to offer you a more comfortable life befitting a woman of your obvious refinement and intelligence." Thomas chuckled. "He doesn't seem to realize you're already married." Eleanor rolled her eyes as she kneaded bread for their morning meal. "I've stopped reading most of them. Half want to marry me, a quarter want to hire me, and the rest want to run me out of the territory." But among the flood of correspondence were letters that mattered, messages from communities across the West that had successfully fought off similar corporate predation using the legal strategies and organizing principles Eleanor and her allies had developed. Each victory felt like validation of the price they'd paid for their resistance. The small library Eleanor had established in Sage Hollow grew into something much larger, becoming a research center where lawyers, activists, and journalists could access documents and case studies related to corporate corruption in the territories. Thomas built custom shelves and reading tables, creating a space that attracted visitors from as far away as California and Texas. Their children, Hope and Daniel, grew up in this environment of intellectual ferment and social activism. They were accustomed to important visitors appearing at their kitchen table, to conversations about law and justice over dinner, to parents who believed deeply that individuals had both the power and the responsibility to fight for what was right. Hope, even as a young child, showed her mother's intellectual curiosity and moral certainty. She would listen intently to adult conversations about legal strategies and political maneuvering, asking pointed questions that often surprised the learned men and women who visited their home. Daniel inherited his father's mechanical aptitude and quiet strength. By age 10, he was already helping Thomas in the workshop, learning to shape wood with the same patient precision his father had mastered, despite his physical limitations. "They're going to have choices we never had," Eleanor observed one evening, as she and Thomas watched their children play in the garden. "Hope could become a lawyer if she wants to, maybe even a judge someday. Daniel could be an engineer or an architect. Or they could choose something completely different," Thomas replied. "That's what we've been fighting for, the right for people to choose their own paths." As the children grew older, Eleanor began writing down the story of her transformation from Eleanor Hartwell to Eleanor Walker to Eleanor Kane. What started as a private journal evolved into something more ambitious, a memoir that she hoped might inspire other women facing similar choices between security and independence. The writing process forced her to confront aspects of her past that she'd tried to leave buried. The privileged childhood in Chicago, the gradual realization that her family's wealth came at the cost of others' suffering, the painful decision to abandon everything familiar for an uncertain future in the desert. "I'm not trying to justify my choices," she wrote in one particularly difficult chapter. "I made mistakes, hurt people who cared about me, ran away from responsibilities I should have faced. But I also learned that sometimes running away is the only way to find out who you really are." Thomas read each chapter as she completed it, offering suggestions and encouragement. His perspective on their shared experiences often differed from hers in subtle but important ways, reminding her that even the most intimate partnerships involve two separate individuals with their own ways of understanding the world. "You're being too hard on yourself about Chicago," he said, after reading her account of her departure from the mining company. "You were barely 22 years old, facing pressure from men with decades of experience in manipulation and control. The fact that you found the strength to walk away shows remarkable courage. But I could have fought them there, tried to reform the company from within. Maybe. Or maybe they would have destroyed you and found someone more compliant to take your place. Sometimes the most important battles are fought by people who've removed themselves from the corrupted system. The memoir project was interrupted by a crisis that struck closer to home than any they'd faced since the railroad conflict. Daniel, now 16 and increasingly independent, had begun spending time with a group of young men who worked for the area's mining operations. Eleanor noticed changes in his behavior, secrecy about his activities, unexplained absences, a new hardness in his manner that reminded her uncomfortably of the corporate enforcers she'd fought against. The truth came out when Thomas discovered dynamite hidden in their barn. When confronted, Daniel admitted that he and his friends had been planning to sabotage equipment at a mining operation that was using unsafe working conditions and refusing to pay fair wages. "They're treating the workers like slaves, Ma," he said defiantly, as Eleanor and Thomas faced him across their kitchen table. "Somebody has to stand up to them." "Not like this," Eleanor replied firmly. "Not with violence and destruction. But you fought the railroad. You and Pa both did things that weren't exactly legal." Thomas leaned forward, his expression serious. "Son, there's a difference between strategic resistance and random violence. We never tried to hurt people or destroy property just to make a point. We used the law whenever possible, and when we went outside it, we accepted the consequences," Eleanor added. "What you're talking about is terrorism, and it only gives our enemies an excuse to use even worse violence against us." The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of Eleanor's life as a parent. She found herself trying to explain the complex moral distinctions between different forms of resistance, while also acknowledging Daniel's legitimate anger at injustice. In the end, they reached a compromise. Daniel would abandon his plans for sabotage, but Eleanor would help him research legal methods for addressing the mining company's violations. Together, they would investigate working conditions, document safety violations, and build a case for government intervention. The project became a family affair, with Hope using her research skills to dig up information about the mining company's corporate structure and financial backing. Thomas contributed his knowledge of workplace safety from his own experience as a laborer and craftsman. Even Mary Hutchins and other community members helped by interviewing workers and their families about conditions in the mines. What they discovered was worse than Eleanor had expected. The mining company was part of a larger network of operations that systematically exploited workers throughout the territory, using methods that reminded her uncomfortably of the practices she'd fled in Chicago. Workers were paid in company scrip that could only be used at company stores. Housing was substandard and overpriced. Safety equipment was virtually non-existent. But unlike her younger self, Eleanor now had the experience and connections to fight such practices effectively. She reached out to her network of lawyers and journalists, building a coalition that could challenge the mining companies through legal channels rather than violence. The campaign took 2 years and involved testimony before territorial legislature, newspaper exposés, and ultimately federal intervention. When it was over, working conditions in Arizona's mines had improved dramatically, and several company executives had been prosecuted for violations of federal labor laws. Daniel, now 18 and preparing to leave home for college, had learned valuable lessons about the power of organized, strategic resistance. "I understand now why you chose the law over dynamite," he told Eleanor, as they watched the final court proceedings. "It takes longer, but it lasts." Hope, 2 years younger but equally committed to social justice, had decided to pursue legal education with the goal of becoming the territory's first female lawyer. The possibility would have been unthinkable when Eleanor first arrived in Sage Hollow, but the changing times had opened doors that previous generations couldn't have imagined. As Eleanor entered her 40s, she found herself reflecting more often on the journey that had brought her to this point. The frightened young woman who'd fled Chicago seemed like a different person, someone she could barely remember being. The desert had burned away everything non-essential, leaving behind someone she was proud to be. Thomas, now in his 50s, had adapted to his role as husband to a famous reformer with characteristic grace and humor. He still preferred working with his hands to making speeches, but he'd proven himself an invaluable strategist and organizer when the situation demanded it. "No regrets?" he asked her one evening, as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Eleanor considered the question, as she always did when he asked it. The privileged life she'd given up, the social connections she'd severed, the financial security she'd abandoned. All of it seemed like artifacts from someone else's existence. "Not a single one," she said, and meant it more deeply than ever. The desert roses that bloomed around their home had multiplied over the years, creating a garden that visitors often described as impossible, a place where beauty flourished in conditions that should have been hostile to growth. Like the woman who tended them, they had learned to find strength in harsh circumstances, to bloom, not despite the desert, but because of what it had taught them about resilience and adaptation. Eleanor's memoir was eventually published by Margaret Sinclair's father's newspaper, serialized over several months, and later collected into a book that became widely read throughout the West. But by then, Eleanor Kane had moved on to new challenges, new battles that needed fighting, new communities that needed organizing. The desert had made her into something she'd never expected to become, not just a survivor, but a creator of the conditions that allowed others to survive and thrive. And in the end, that transformation was worth more than any fortune she'd given up, any comfort she'd sacrificed, any price she'd paid for the right to write her own story in the harsh but honest language of the American frontier. The desert had taught her that the most beautiful things often grew in the harshest places, that strength could be found in the most unlikely circumstances. She'd come west as a runaway heiress, but she'd become something better, a woman who'd helped build a community and a movement that would outlast her own lifetime. When visitors came to Sage Hollow in later years, drawn by stories of the legendary Desert Rose, they would find a thriving town surrounded by carefully tended farms and ranches. They would meet an older woman whose hands bore the calluses of honest work, and whose eyes held the deep satisfaction of someone who'd found her true purpose in life. And if they asked about her past, she would smile and say only that everyone deserved the chance to write their own story, to choose their own name, to build their own version of happiness from whatever materials life provided. The desert roses that bloomed around her home were tough, resilient flowers that thrived in conditions that would kill more delicate plants. They were beautiful not because they were perfect, but because they had learned to find beauty in survival, strength in adaptation, grace in endurance. Like the woman who tended them, they had transformed a harsh desert into a garden where hope could bloom eternal.